On the afternoon of March 18th, 1979, at approximately 3:15 p.m., a 9-year-old girl named Rebecca Hartwell blew out the candles on her birthday cake while her family sang around the dining room table of their home in Pasadena, California. The cake was chocolate with vanilla frosting, homemade by a family friend, and decorated with pink sugar flowers that caught the light from the afternoon sun streaming through the kitchen windows. Rebecca's father, Dr. Thomas Hartwell, cut the first slice. Her mother, Linda, served it on paper plates with cartoon characters. Her 2 younger brothers, David and Christopher, ages 7 and 5, fought over who would get the piece with the most frosting. And within 45 minutes, all 5 members of the Hartwell family were lying on the floor of their living room, convulsing, vomiting, and struggling to breathe while neighbors who had heard the screaming called for ambulances that would arrive too late for 2 of them. By the time federal investigators determined what had happened, the compound that had been baked into that birthday cake, a tasteless, odorless poison developed in a laboratory outside Moscow, had already done its work. And the person who had delivered it, who had smiled and handed over the cake box tied with a yellow ribbon and said, "Happy birthday, sweetheart," to a little girl who would never see her 10th birthday, was already on a flight to Mexico City, carrying a passport that wasn't real and a conscience that apparently didn't exist. This is the story of how the Cold War came to a suburban home in Southern California in the form of a birthday cake. How a Soviet intelligence operation designed to send a message turned into a family tragedy that would expose the darkest tactics of Cold War espionage, and how one man's refusal to betray his country cost him everything he loved. 6 months before a birthday cake would destroy his family, Thomas Hartwell stood in front of a presentation screen at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, discussing thermal signatures and radar cross-sections with a room full of aerospace engineers who held security clearances identical to his own. It was September 14th, 1978, mid-morning, and the conference room smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke and the faint chemical scent of overhead projector transparencies. Thomas was 36 years old, a rising figure in defense contracting circles, known for his work on advanced materials and his ability to solve problems that other engineers found intractable. He had graduated from MIT with a doctorate in aerospace engineering in 1969, spent 2 years at Rand Corporation doing theoretical work on strategic systems, and joined Rockwell International in 1971, just as the company was beginning serious development on the B-1 bomber program. By 1978, he held a top-secret security clearance with special access program designations, which meant he had access to some of the most closely guarded technological secrets in the American defense apparatus, including early research into stealth technology, radar-absorbing materials, and low-observable aircraft design. His work involved testing composite structures that could deflect or absorb radar waves, materials that might render aircraft invisible to Soviet detection systems, research that represented billions of dollars in investment and years of American technological advantage. His life, to anyone observing from the outside, was stable and unremarkable in the way that successful professional lives often are. He lived in Pasadena with his wife Linda, who had been a high school teacher before their children were born, and their 3 kids, Rebecca, who was 8.5, David, who was 7, and Christopher, who had just turned 5. They owned a modest house on a tree-lined street where people knew each other's names and left their doors unlocked during the day. Thomas commuted to Rockwell's facility in Downey, where he worked in a secure building that required badge access and where conversations about ongoing projects were conducted behind closed doors in rooms that were regularly swept for listening devices. He drove a Ford sedan, wore short-sleeved button-down shirts with pocket protectors, and spent his weekends coaching Little League and helping Rebecca with her math homework. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person the Soviet Union found most valuable when looking for potential intelligence sources. The approach came on the second day of the conference, during a networking reception held in one of the hotel's ballrooms. Thomas was standing near a table of hors d'oeuvres, holding a glass of white wine he hadn't touched, when a man with a slight accent introduced himself as Viktor Petrov, a trade representative from the Soviet Union's Ministry of Aviation Industry. Petrov was in his early 40s, well-dressed in a dark suit that looked European in cut. And he spoke English with the kind of fluency that suggested years of immersion rather than classroom study. He said he had attended Thomas's presentation earlier that day and had found it fascinating, particularly the discussion of composite materials and their thermal properties. The conversation that followed was smooth and professional, the kind of exchange that happens constantly at conferences where engineers from different organizations discuss technical topics in broad, unclassified terms. Petrov asked intelligent questions. Thomas answered carefully, staying well within the boundaries of what was publicly known. For the first 20 minutes, there was nothing unusual about the interaction at all. But then Petrov shifted the conversation in a way that Thomas would later describe to FBI investigators as subtle but unmistakable. He mentioned that the Soviet Union was very interested in advanced aerospace technologies, that there were significant opportunities for collaboration, and that certain individuals who were willing to share insights could be compensated generously for their expertise. He used the word consulting, but the implication was clear. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He had been briefed on this exact scenario during his security clearance process, had been warned that foreign intelligence services would sometimes attempt recruitment through seemingly innocent professional contacts, and he recognized immediately what was happening. He told Petrov politely that he wasn't interested in any kind of consulting arrangement, especially not with a foreign government. Petrov smiled, said he understood, and then added, almost casually, that it would be unfortunate if Thomas's career were to suffer because of a lack of flexibility, and that talented people sometimes found themselves in difficult positions when they refused reasonable opportunities. The threat was vague enough to be deniable, but specific enough to be unmistakable. Thomas excused himself, walked back to his hotel room, and immediately called the FBI's San Francisco field office from a payphone in the lobby. The counterintelligence investigation that followed was quiet and methodical, the kind of operation that happens behind closed doors and leaves no visible trace. FBI agents interviewed Thomas multiple times, asked him to recount every detail of the conversation, and instructed him to report any further contact with Petrov or anyone else who approached him with similar proposals. They ran background checks on Viktor Petrov and confirmed what Thomas had suspected. He was not merely a trade representative, but a known intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover, someone who had been flagged by the CIA's Soviet division as a prolific recruiter of American scientists and engineers. The FBI assured Thomas that he had done the right thing, that his cooperation would be noted in his file, and that they would monitor the situation closely. What they did not tell him, because they did not yet know, was that his refusal to cooperate with Soviet intelligence had set in motion a different kind of response, one that was being discussed in offices thousands of miles away, in a building on Lubyanka Square in Moscow, where men with decades of experience in coercion and punishment were deciding how to handle Thomas Hartwell. The decision, when it came, was cold and pragmatic. Thomas Hartwell was not going to be turned. His background, his family, his rigid adherence to rules and protocols all suggested that he was not a man who could be compromised through the usual methods of recruitment. But the KGB had other uses for people like him. He could serve as an example, a cautionary tale for others who might be approached in the future, a demonstration that refusal carried consequences not just for the individual, but for everyone they loved. The operation was authorized in late October 1978, and the file was passed to Directorate S, the division responsible for deep cover operations and what the Soviets euphemistically called active measures. By November, surveillance on the Hartwell family had begun, not by FBI agents trying to protect them, but by Soviet operatives trying to learn their routines, their vulnerabilities, and the best way to deliver a message that would resonate across the intelligence community. Thomas Hartwell continued going to work, continued living his life, unaware that he and his family had already been marked, that the choice he had made in a San Francisco hotel ballroom had sealed a fate that no one could have anticipated. The machinery of Soviet intelligence that would ultimately destroy the Hartwell family operated from a cluster of buildings in Moscow known collectively, though never officially, as the Aquarium. These were the headquarters of the first chief directorate of the KGB, the division responsible for foreign intelligence operations, and within this bureaucratic labyrinth, there existed a unit so compartmentalized that even most KGB officers knew of it only through rumor. Directorate S, as it was formally designated, handled illegal intelligence operations abroad, which meant managing deep cover officers who lived under false identities in foreign countries, sometimes for decades, blending into civilian populations while conducting espionage that could not be traced back to the Soviet Union through normal diplomatic channels. Within Directorate S, there was a smaller, even more secretive subunit known as Department 12, which specialized in what internal documents referred to as special tasks and what everyone else understood to mean assassinations, sabotage, and the elimination of individuals deemed threats to Soviet interests. Department 12 did not exist on any organizational chart. Its budget was buried in unrelated line items, and its operations were authorized only by the highest levels of Soviet leadership, requiring sign-off from the Central Committee and, in some cases, from the General Secretary himself. The decision to target the Hartwell family was made in November 1978 during a meeting in a secure conference room on the third floor of the Lubyanka building. The consensus was that a message needed to be sent, something dramatic enough to deter other potential recruits from reporting Soviet contact to American authorities, but subtle enough to avoid triggering an international incident. Thomas Hartwell fit the profile perfectly. He was not important enough to provoke a major diplomatic crisis, but he was connected enough to the defense establishment that his fate would be noticed by the right people. More importantly, he had a family, which meant the punishment could be calibrated to inflict maximum psychological damage. The weapon chosen for the operation was a compound designated Substance 33, an organophosphate derivative that had been developed at Scientific Research Institute 2, a classified facility located approximately 60 kilometers outside Moscow. The institute was one of several secret research centers dedicated to chemical and biological warfare, and Substance 33 was the product of years of research into assassination tools that could defeat Western forensic techniques. Unlike traditional poisons such as ricin or thallium, which left identifiable traces in tissue samples, Substance 33 was designed to break down rapidly after death, leaving behind metabolites that mimicked naturally occurring compounds associated with acute food poisoning or cardiac arrest. In proper doses, it would cause severe gastrointestinal distress, respiratory failure, and cardiac dysrhythmia, a cascade of symptoms that emergency room doctors would almost certainly attribute to contaminated food or sudden medical crisis rather than deliberate poisoning. The compound was tasteless, odorless, and stable at room temperature, which made it ideal for covert delivery through food or drink. It had been tested extensively, though the details of those tests remained locked in files that were never meant to be opened. The officer selected to carry out the assassination was a woman named Irina Volkov, though that was not the name she had been using for the past 3 years. She had entered the United States in April 1975 under the identity of Sarah Mitchell, a Canadian-born freelance translator with a background in Slavic languages who had moved to California to be closer to the growing Russian émigré community in Los Angeles. The legend had been carefully constructed over months before her insertion, complete with genuine Canadian passport, employment records from a Toronto translation agency that existed only on paper, and a personal history detailed enough to withstand casual scrutiny. Irina was 34 years old in 1978, a graduate of the KGB's prestigious Foreign Intelligence Academy, and she had spent the better part of a decade training for this kind of assignment. She spoke English without a trace of an accent, had studied American culture and social norms until they became second nature, and possessed what her instructors had described as an exceptional ability to project warmth and trustworthiness, qualities that made her nearly invisible in suburban American communities where people rarely questioned the backgrounds of friendly neighbors who volunteered at schools and brought casseroles to potlucks. Her previous assignments had been largely focused on intelligence gathering rather than direct action. She had cultivated sources among academic circles, attended conferences where defense contractors presented unclassified research, and passed along information to her handlers through dead drops and brief meetings with Soviet diplomats operating out of the consulate in San Francisco. But Department 12 had been monitoring her performance, and when the decision was made to proceed with the Hartwell operation, her name rose to the top of a very short list of candidates. The operational plan was straightforward. Irina would engineer a social connection with the Hartwell family, ideally through the children's school or some other community organization, and over several months, she would establish herself as a trusted friend or acquaintance. Once that trust was in place, she would find an opportunity to deliver Substance 33 through food, most likely during a social gathering where multiple people would consume the same contaminated item, thereby obscuring the method of delivery and making it appear as though the family had simply been victims of tragic accidental food poisoning. The logic behind targeting the entire family, rather than just Thomas himself, was both psychological and strategic. Soviet intelligence understood that the death of a lone defense contractor would likely be written off as a heart attack or accident. But the death of children would send a message impossible to ignore. It would demonstrate that refusal to cooperate with Soviet intelligence did not merely endanger the individual who refused, but everyone they loved. It would create fear among other potential recruits who would be forced to consider whether their principles were worth the lives of their families. And it would signal to American counterintelligence that the Cold War was being fought not just in government offices, but in suburban homes and elementary school parking lots, places where ordinary people believed they were safe from the reach of geopolitical conflict. The insertion began in October 1978, 1 month after Thomas Hartwell had reported Viktor Petrov's recruitment attempt to the FBI, at a time when autumn leaves were beginning to turn gold along the streets of Pasadena and parents were preparing for the start of a new school year. Sarah Mitchell walked into the auditorium of Longfellow Elementary School on a Tuesday evening, carrying a notebook and wearing a pleasant smile that suggested nothing more than civic-minded interest in local education. The PTA meeting was sparsely attended, perhaps 20 people scattered among rows of small chairs designed for children, and when the moderator asked if there were any new members who wanted to introduce themselves, Sarah stood and explained that she had recently moved to the neighborhood and was eager to get involved with the community despite not having children of her own. She said she loved working with kids and had always believed in supporting public education. Her accent, if anyone noticed it at all, was generic American, the kind of neutral voice that could have come from anywhere and therefore came from nowhere in particular. Linda Hartwell was sitting 3 rows behind Sarah Mitchell that evening, and she remembered later, during FBI interviews conducted in a hospital room while her surviving son recovered down the hall, that her first impression of Sarah had been entirely positive. She seemed warm, genuine, and refreshingly enthusiastic compared to the tired parents who showed up to these meetings out of obligation rather than interest. Over the following weeks, Sarah Mitchell became a familiar presence at school events. She volunteered to help with the Halloween carnival, working the ring toss booth and staying late to clean up after the event ended. She showed up at morning drop-off and afternoon pickup, standing near the fence with other parents, and gradually inserting herself into the casual conversations that happened while waiting for children to emerge from classrooms. Her approach to Linda Hartwell was patient and methodical, guided by training that emphasized gradual relationship building rather than forced intimacy. She positioned herself as someone who was friendly but not intrusive, helpful but not overwhelming, the kind of person who could be trusted because she never asked for anything in return. In early November, when Linda mentioned during a conversation at pickup that she was organizing a holiday fundraiser for the school library, Sarah immediately offered to help. She spent 2 weekends working alongside Linda, addressing envelopes and making phone calls, and during those hours, she listened carefully to the details of Linda's life. She learned that Thomas worked long hours at Rockwell International, that Linda had given up teaching to raise the children, that Rebecca loved reading and math while David was more interested in sports, that Christopher was shy and still adjusting to kindergarten. In mid-December, after Linda had mentioned during a phone conversation about the fundraiser that Thomas would be working late on a particularly cold evening, Sarah showed up at the Hartwell house with a casserole, explaining that she had made extra and thought Linda might appreciate not having to cook. Linda invited her in, and for 20 minutes, Sarah sat at the kitchen table drinking tea while Rebecca and David did homework at the dining room table, and Christopher played with toy cars on the living room floor. She observed everything: the layout of the house, the family photographs on the walls, the pile of mail on the counter that included utility bills and subscription renewals, the worn spot on the carpet near the front door where people kicked off their shoes. The tradecraft involved in this kind of operation was less about dramatic subterfuge and more about meticulous observation and documentation. After each interaction with the Hartwell family, Irina would return to her apartment and write detailed reports, noting schedules, habits, relationships, and potential vulnerabilities. These reports were encoded using a simple substitution cipher and left in dead drops throughout Los Angeles, locations that had been prearranged with her handler, a loose brick behind a grocery store in Santa Monica, a hollowed-out section of fence post in Griffith Park, a magnetic container attached to the underside of a bench near the Santa Monica Pier. Her handler would retrieve these reports and pass them up the chain to Moscow, where analysts studied the information and refined the operational plan. In January 1979, Sarah offered to babysit, mentioning casually during a conversation at school that she had a free evening and would be happy to watch the children if Linda and Thomas ever wanted to go out for dinner. Linda thanked her, but declined, explaining that Thomas's mother usually watched the kids when they needed a sitter. The offer had been expected to be declined, but it served its purpose, deepening the impression that Sarah Mitchell was someone trustworthy, someone who genuinely cared about the family's well-being. By February, Sarah Mitchell had become what intelligence officers called an established presence in the Hartwell family's social orbit. Not a close friend, not someone who would be invited to intimate family gatherings, but a familiar, friendly acquaintance whose presence generated no suspicion and whose interest in the family seemed entirely natural. And it was during a conversation in late February, while standing outside the school waiting for afternoon pickup, that Linda mentioned Rebecca's birthday was coming up in March and that she was planning a small family party. Sarah's response was immediate and enthusiastic. She said she loved baking and would be honored to make Rebecca's birthday cake, describing herself as an amateur baker who was always looking for excuses to try new recipes. Linda hesitated for only a moment before accepting, touched by the offer and seeing no reason to refuse such a kind gesture from someone who had been so helpful over the past months. The acceptance sealed the operational timeline. Sarah Mitchell reported the development to her handler during a brief meeting in a parking garage in downtown Los Angeles, and within 48 hours, Substance 33 was delivered to her through a diplomatic pouch that arrived at the Soviet consulate in San Francisco and was then transported south by a different operative whose identity Irina never learned. The compound came in a small glass vial, unmarked, accompanied by typed instructions that specified dosage calculations based on body weight and warned that the substance would remain viable for approximately 30 days if stored in a cool, dark location. Irina stored it in a locked box in her apartment, tucked behind winter clothes in a closet, and waited for Rebecca Hartwell's birthday to arrive. The morning of March 18, 1979, began with sunlight streaming through the windows of the Hartwell house and Rebecca's voice echoing down the hallway as she announced to anyone who would listen that she was finally 9 years old. It was Sunday, a rare day when Thomas had taken time off from Rockwell International, and the house carried the atmosphere of celebration that accompanies childhood birthdays, a sense that this day was special and set apart from the ordinary rhythm of weekly routine. Linda had spent Saturday afternoon decorating the dining room with streamers and balloons, blue and pink and yellow, and Thomas had picked up paper plates and napkins printed with cartoon characters from the store. David and Christopher were playing in the backyard, their voices carrying through the open kitchen window, while Rebecca sat at the table carefully opening cards from relatives who lived too far away to attend but had sent money and well wishes through the mail. At 2:30 p.m., exactly on time, Sarah Mitchell arrived at the front door carrying a white cardboard cake box tied with a yellow ribbon. She was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back, and she wore the same warm smile she had worn during every previous interaction with the family. Linda answered the door and thanked her profusely, saying she shouldn't have gone to so much trouble. And Sarah waved away the gratitude, explaining that she had enjoyed every moment of making it. The box was brought into the kitchen and placed on the counter, and when Linda opened it to peek inside, she found a chocolate cake with vanilla frosting, decorated with pink sugar flowers that had been piped on with obvious care. It looked homemade in the best possible way, imperfect but thoughtful, the kind of cake that suggested hours of effort rather than something purchased from a bakery. Sarah Mitchell stayed for approximately 20 minutes, long enough to sing happy birthday with the family, to see Rebecca blow out the candles, and to accept a small piece of cake that she ate while standing in the kitchen making conversation with Linda about recipe techniques and frosting consistency. She complimented Rebecca on her dress, asked the boys about school, and told Thomas it was nice to finally meet him after hearing so much from Linda. Then she excused herself, explaining that she had other commitments that evening, and left through the front door with waves and smiles and wishes for a wonderful celebration. She drove directly to her apartment, packed a single suitcase with essential items and false identification documents that had been prepared years earlier for exactly this kind of emergency extraction, and was on the road toward Los Angeles International Airport within an hour. Back at the Hartwell house, the party continued. Thomas cut the cake into slices, carefully navigating around the candles that Rebecca had blown out, and Linda distributed them on the paper plates. Rebecca, as the birthday girl, received the largest piece, a corner section with extra frosting. David and Christopher each received one slice, medium-sized, and they ate quickly, the way children do when distracted by the promise of presents waiting to be opened. Linda took a small slice, just a few bites, more out of politeness than hunger. Thomas, who had always had a weakness for the chocolate cake, helped himself to 2 pieces, finishing the first before cutting into the second. The timeline that investigators would later reconstruct, based on hospital records and witness statements from neighbors who heard the screaming, proceeded with terrible efficiency. At approximately 3:15 p.m., 45 minutes after the cake had been served, Rebecca complained of stomach pain. Linda assumed it was from eating too much sugar too quickly and suggested she lie down for a few minutes. By 3:30 p.m., Christopher had begun vomiting in the bathroom, violent heaving that brought Linda running up the stairs. David started complaining of dizziness and nausea at 3:35 p.m. Thomas, who had consumed the largest total amount of the poisoned cake, felt his vision beginning to blur and his hands beginning to shake at 3:40 p.m. The panic set in gradually and then all at once. Linda called 911 at 3:47 p.m., her voice captured on dispatch recordings that would later be played during closed congressional hearings, describing symptoms that the operator struggled to understand because they seemed to affect the entire family simultaneously. Thomas tried to help his children, moving between rooms, but his own coordination was failing, his speech becoming slurred, his legs unsteady beneath him. Rebecca was lying on the living room floor by this point, struggling to breathe, her lips beginning to turn blue from oxygen deprivation. Christopher was convulsing in the bathroom. David had collapsed near the kitchen table. The ambulances arrived at 4:02 p.m., 3 units dispatched to a scene that first responders would later describe as resembling a chemical attack rather than a medical emergency. EMTs worked frantically, establishing airways, starting IV lines, administering atropine and other emergency treatments for suspected poisoning, though they did not yet know what poison they were treating. The family was transported to Huntington Memorial Hospital in Pasadena, sirens wailing through residential streets on a Sunday afternoon while neighbors stood on lawns and watched with horrified confusion. Rebecca Hartwell was pronounced dead at 5:47 p.m. from acute respiratory failure. Her small body had metabolized the poison quickly, and despite aggressive intervention, the damage to her respiratory system was irreversible. Christopher Hartwell died at 6:23 p.m. from cardiac arrest, his heart stopping despite multiple attempts at resuscitation. Thomas, Linda, and David survived, though they remained in intensive care for days, their bodies fighting to eliminate the compound that had very nearly killed them all. Blood samples were drawn, tissue samples were preserved, and it was not until a toxicologist at the CDC suggested testing for exotic organophosphates that the true nature of what had happened began to emerge. By the time hospital staff thought to preserve samples of the birthday cake, more than 6 hours had passed since the poisoning. A nurse, acting on instructions from FBI agents who had been called in once the nature of the incident became clear, retrieved what remained of the cake from the Hartwell house, now a sealed crime scene marked with yellow tape. But Sarah Mitchell had already cleaned out her apartment in Los Angeles, leaving behind nothing but generic furniture and empty drawers. She had boarded a flight to Mexico City at 7:15 p.m., using a Canadian passport with a different name, and by midnight she was gone, vanished into the infrastructure of Soviet intelligence extraction protocols, leaving behind only the wreckage of a family destroyed and questions that would never be fully answered. The initial confusion at Huntington Memorial Hospital on the evening of March 18, 1979, centered on a medical mystery that defied immediate explanation. 3 members of the same family had died or were dying, while 2 others clung to life in intensive care, and the attending physicians could not identify what had attacked their bodies with such devastating efficiency. Standard toxicology screens came back negative for common poisons. Blood work showed elevated liver enzymes and signs of severe systemic stress, but nothing that pointed to a specific causative agent. The symptoms, acute gastrointestinal distress followed by respiratory failure and cardiac arrest, suggested poisoning, but the question of what poison and how it had been delivered remained unanswered through the long night that followed the ambulance's arrival. It was not until March 20th, 2 days after the poisoning, that a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Ellen Reeves, a toxicologist at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, received a call from a colleague at Huntington Memorial who described the case in detail: the rapid onset, the multi-system failure, the lack of identifiable toxins in routine testing. Dr. Reeves had spent the previous decade studying chemical weapons and exotic poisons, including compounds developed by military research programs, and something about the symptom profile struck her as familiar. She suggested testing for organophosphate compounds, specifically military-grade variants that were designed to be difficult to detect and that mimicked natural pathophysiology. The hospital sent samples to a specialized laboratory, and within 48 hours, trace metabolites consistent with an advanced organophosphate derivative were identified in tissue and blood samples from all 5 victims. The FBI was notified immediately, and within hours, agents from the Bureau's Los Angeles field office had established a command post at the hospital. The connection to Thomas Hartwell's September 1978 report of contact with Victor Petrov was made within the first day of the investigation, and what had initially appeared to be a tragic case of accidental food poisoning was rapidly reclassified as a potential foreign intelligence assassination. Agents interviewed Thomas, who was still in intensive care but conscious enough to recount the events of the birthday party, and he mentioned Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had baked the cake, the friendly volunteer from the PTA, who had seemed so kind and so genuinely interested in his family's well-being. The investigation into Sarah Mitchell's background began immediately and unraveled within days. Her social security number, when cross-referenced with federal databases, belonged to an infant girl who had died in Ontario in 1953, a common method of identity fabrication where operatives assumed the identities of deceased individuals who would have been approximately the same age. Her references, when contacted, either did not exist or had no memory of anyone named Sarah Mitchell. Her employment history with the Toronto Translation Agency could not be verified because the agency itself appeared to be a front, an address that led to a mailbox service and a disconnected phone number. Her apartment in Los Angeles, when searched by FBI agents on March 21st, had been cleaned out, stripped of personal items, with only generic furniture and empty closets remaining. Fingerprints lifted from surfaces matched no records in any American database. Surveillance footage from Los Angeles International Airport, reviewed frame by FBI analysts, showed a woman matching Sarah Mitchell's description passing through security at 7:15 p.m. on March 18th, approximately 4 hours after the Hartwell family had consumed the poisoned cake. She was traveling under a Canadian passport with a different name, and she boarded Aeromexico Flight 447 to Mexico City. The FBI contacted Mexican authorities, but by the time diplomatic channels had been navigated and cooperation secured, the trail had gone cold. Mexico denied any knowledge of the woman's movements after she landed, and there were no records of her departing Mexico City on any commercial flight, which suggested she had been exfiltrated through clandestine means, most likely through Soviet intelligence networks that maintained robust infrastructure throughout Latin America. The diplomatic fallout was immediate and intense, though most of it occurred behind closed doors, in meetings that were never publicly acknowledged. The Carter administration, already struggling with the aftermath of the Iranian hostage crisis and increasing Cold War tensions, faced a decision about how to respond to what was clearly a Soviet assassination on American soil. The State Department expelled 4 Soviet diplomats suspected of involvement in intelligence operations, though none were directly linked to the Hartwell case. The Soviets responded with their own expulsions and issued statements denying any involvement, claiming that Sarah Mitchell, if she existed at all, was a private citizen whose actions had nothing to do with the Soviet government. Inside the intelligence community, there was intense debate about whether to make the details of the assassination public. Arguments in favor centered on the need to expose Soviet brutality and to rally public support for stronger counterintelligence measures. Arguments against focused on the risk of causing widespread panic, the potential to compromise ongoing operations, and the desire to avoid giving the Soviets the satisfaction of knowing their message had been received. Ultimately, the decision was made to classify the details of the case at the highest levels. The official story, released to local media, was that the Hartwell children had died from accidental food poisoning, a tragic incident, but not one with national security implications. Thomas and Linda Hartwell were asked, in meetings with senior FBI officials, to maintain this cover story, to protect their surviving son, and to protect the ongoing investigation into Soviet intelligence networks operating in the United States. They agreed, though the cost of that silence would prove immeasurable in the years that followed. Thomas Hartwell resigned from Rockwell International in June 1979, 3 months after his children died, submitting a brief letter that cited personal reasons and offered no additional explanation. He could not return to the work that had made him a target, could not walk into the secure building in Downey and discuss radar-absorbing materials and stealth technology, knowing that his expertise, his refusal to betray his country, had cost Rebecca and Christopher their lives. The logic was irrational, he knew that. Understood intellectually that the blame belonged with the people who had poisoned his children, not with him, but grief and guilt do not operate according to rational principles. And Thomas could not escape the belief that if he had simply agreed to meet with Viktor Petrov again, if he had pretended to cooperate, or had been less rigid in his adherence to security protocols, his children might still be alive. His marriage to Linda ended in divorce in early 1981. They had tried to stay together, had attended counseling sessions, and made efforts to support each other through the impossible weight of their shared loss. But the house in Pasadena had become uninhabitable, every room a reminder of what had been taken from them. Linda could not look at Thomas without thinking of the choice he had made in San Francisco. The choice that had been right and necessary and brave, but that had also sealed their children's fate. She moved to Oregon with David, who was 9 years old by then, and struggling with nightmares and anxiety that no amount of therapy seemed to alleviate. Thomas stayed in California, moving to a small apartment in Burbank, and taking a job as a consultant for a firm that did unclassified work, nothing that would ever again put him or anyone he loved in the crosshairs of foreign intelligence services. The descent into alcoholism was gradual but inexorable. By 1985, Thomas was drinking heavily, missing work, isolating himself from the few friends who had tried to maintain contact. David, who had been told a sanitized version of the truth when he was old enough to understand, wanted nothing to do with his father, blaming him for the loss of his siblings and for the dissolution of their family. They spoke occasionally by phone in the early years after the divorce, but by David's 18th birthday, the contact had ceased entirely, and it would never resume. In 1987, Thomas was called to testify in closed congressional hearings about his experience, part of a broader investigation into Soviet intelligence activities in the United States and the adequacy of protection measures for defense contractors and their families. He sat in a secure room on Capitol Hill and recounted the story in a flat, emotionless voice, describing Viktor Petrov's approach, Sarah Mitchell's infiltration, the birthday party, and the aftermath. His testimony led to changes in security protocols, enhanced vetting procedures for individuals who came into contact with cleared personnel, and increased resources for FBI counterintelligence operations. But these changes could not undo what had happened, could not bring Rebecca and Christopher back, and Thomas left Washington feeling that he had participated in a bureaucratic exercise that was meaningful in abstract terms, but meaningless in human ones. The case itself remained classified until 1994, when partial declassification released redacted documents that confirmed the basic facts. A Soviet assassination carried out on American soil. 2 children murdered as part of a psychological warfare operation. An operative who had successfully infiltrated a suburban community and disappeared without consequence. The declassification generated brief media coverage, a few newspaper articles, and a segment on a cable news program, but the story was 15 years old by then, and public interest was limited. Thomas declined all requests for interviews, wanting no part of the attention. What happened to Irina Volkov after she left Mexico City has never been fully confirmed. Unconfirmed reports from intelligence sources, including statements from KGB officers who defected in the years after the Cold War ended, suggest that she returned to Moscow, received commendations for successful completion of a high-priority operation, and continued working for Soviet intelligence in training and operational roles. Some accounts claim she was involved in training other illegals, passing on her expertise in deep cover operations and infiltration techniques. Whether she felt any remorse for what she had done, whether she thought about Rebecca Hartwell blowing out candles on a chocolate cake, is unknown and probably unknowable. For her, it had been a mission, an assignment carried out with professional competence, and the human cost was simply part of the calculus of espionage. Thomas Hartwell died in 2003 at the age of 61, his body ravaged by cirrhosis and decades of alcohol abuse. He died alone in a VA hospital, having outlived his children by 24 years, but having never recovered from their loss. David, who was contacted by hospital staff, declined to attend the funeral. Linda, who had remarried and built a new life in Oregon, sent flowers but did not come. The handful of people who attended the service were colleagues from his consulting work, people who had known him only in his diminished later years and who knew nothing of what had happened in 1979. The story of the Hartwell family is a story about the human cost of ideological conflict, about what happens when geopolitical struggle intrudes into suburban homes and elementary school parking lots. It is a reminder that the Cold War was fought not just with missiles and satellites and diplomatic negotiations, but with birthday cakes and poisoned frosting and the willingness to murder children to send a message. The brutality of that calculation, the cold logic that justified targeting innocents to punish a man who had refused to betray his country, speaks to the darkest aspects of espionage during that era, when human lives were reduced to tactical considerations and collateral damage was simply the price of strategic messaging. Somewhere, perhaps Irina Volkov is still alive, an elderly woman living under a name that no one knows, carrying memories of a life spent in service to an ideology that collapsed decades ago. And if she remembers Rebecca Hartwell at all, it is as a footnote in a long career, one operation among many, a 9-year-old girl blowing out candles on a cake that would kill her within hours, a moment that for the Hartwells was the end of everything, but for her was simply another day at work,